Here are two stories of first flights. Here's a scene from the HBO miniseries John Adams. It's November 1783 in Paris in the Bois de Boulogne. John Adams, Abigail Adams, and Thomas Jefferson stand among this crowd in Paris as witnesses to history, as they witness the historic launch of the Montgolfier brothers' hot air balloon, November 1783, the Montgolfier brothers' hot air balloon. There have been some test flights where they took some animals up, but this will be the first time that a human lifts off the ground. So we see in this scene the faces of the crowd. They behold something wondrous, never ever seen before. The possibilities that imagine what they are experiencing there as they watch for the first time in human history a human being lift off from the ground. What do they feel? Some sense of freedom, some unboundedness? Jefferson, played by Stephen Delane, says, "So our umbilical cord has been severed from Mother Earth for the first time in history. Mankind floats on a limitless plane of air." As portrayed by the inimitable Paul Giamatti, John Adams, ever the curmudgeon and both friend and foe of Jefferson, replies, "Yes, hot air." That's one story of flight. And 63 years ago today, October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial Earth satellite into an elliptical low Earth orbit, Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was only active for about 3 weeks before its battery died, and then it fell back into the atmosphere after about 2 months. When my mom and I first visited the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, where Sputnik is on display, she remarked about how small it was, because in her memory of the time, in the midst of the Cold War, it loomed large and menacing. It was the start of something very big, the space race, and it was a major expansion of the Cold War. Two stories of flight to hold on to a little bit this morning. We all know that we are in the midst of great change, great upheaval, this great turning. We are bearers of witness to history. And these days it feels less in the ways of freedom and something wonderful happening, and something much more touching the sense of being unbound from social mores. Something menacing looms. Today I want to explore what it means and how it feels, and perhaps how we navigate and nurture each other and ourselves in the midst of this tender and traumatic time. Here's a spoiler alert. I don't have a secret answer to this. It's the answer I've been saying all along. We nurture each other by being each other's people, by having safe space to speak our minds and speak our hearts. So if you're waiting for the salve, that's it. I'll tell you in the beginning. I love history, and I think it's because I love a good story. I like how historians fit a puzzle together in ways to make me understand. How does this observation fit this fact, fit with this other analysis of culture, fit with this history and theory of social movements? We say that good teachers make history come alive for us, bring us into the era. Some of us love historical novels. a good piece of fiction that comes alive in a time period about which we know the general scope. These days, I've been reading modern history by way of the daily post from Heather Cox Richardson and her blog, Letters from an American. She's a professor of history at Boston College, interested in the contrast between the image and reality in American politics. You can see that. We really can appreciate that, the image and the reality in American politics. As she says, she believes in democracy despite its frequent failures. Richardson began writing her posts in early November 2019, not quite a year ago, at the height of the Zelensky affair, the so-called quid quo pro from this White House. You remember that it was said that the US would grant an interview or an audience with President Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, if he would. We want you to do us a favor, though, right? So she thought this history needs to be recorded with a particular eye. Her daily post, her daily missive, gives historical insight and context to the overwhelming gush of news stories that we get daily. She's the one that I go to say, this is the thing that you need to remember about this day. This is the important part. For me, she gives form to the history that we are living in and helps me to frame it in such a way that I can move on with my day, most days, without getting stuck in the muck. And as you know, I love language too. I love to explore how we make meaning and how we put words to meaning. And so to bear witness is, to bear is to suffer, to endure, to abide, tolerate. It usually means to sustain without flinching or breaking. My flinch response these days is dialed up pretty high, but so far I haven't broken yet. And a witness is someone who has seen or can give firsthand evidence of some event, a person or a thing giving, you could think of someone who testifies in court, right, as a witness, someone who has knowledge of the facts. Lots of folks I know these days are journaling about these really extraordinary days that we're living in. Certainly they began journaling when COVID came around, if they weren't journalers before. But to have an eyewitness account of what these extraordinary days are like, this very bizarre time in the course of human history, we're here, and how will generations yet to come look back on the actual writing of what the day was like. What was it like to send your kid off to school or to college, or to get married, for your child to get married in the midst of this, to get married while everyone's wearing masks? What is it like to gather with your people that you love across a screen and still share the rituals of worship together? Our firsthand accounts will be meaningful in that way. We are observers and bearers of witness to this moment. We hold it. We are bearing witness to this history that's happening all around us. And I'll say that among you, most of us of a similar age, some younger, some older. And as we come to our discussion, I want to ask the question, what events stand out in your mind? You remember where you were when this happened or that happened. Historical moments are happening all the time. There is this about history: who tells the story and why it matters about who tells the story. In 1957, on this night, in 1957, there were 4 news anchors on 3 different stations, 4 white guys on ABC, CBS, and NBC. There was Huntley and Brinkley, there was John Cameron Swayze, and there was Walter Cronkite. And that's where we got our news. Part of the history that we're living in that feels difficult to manage is this fragmentation of the news. Citizen journalists have given us a completely new experience of the news, and it's up to us to determine what is true. We have thousands of news outlets, and we can get our news in many, many ways. And how do we check what's true or what's not? I personally go to the media bias chart. If you Google media bias chart, you can see whatever source you're looking at and where it fits on the mostly true, mostly false, left, right, center grid. In 1957, there was a shared understanding of what was true. Or is that historical fiction? Was there really a shared understanding of what was true? Who says what is important, what history means, what facts are worth reporting? Well, if you only get up to 4 spots of the news that are supported by advertising and it was fairly homogeneous, you knew what was the top story of the day, but there were lots of pieces of news that didn't get reported. What also happened in 1957, just 1 month prior to Sputnik, was the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The narrative that all Americans were not only created equal, but would be treated equally in law, was what the Civil Rights Act made manifest. The song that we heard before, this song Seriously, is in fact historical fiction from 2016. Singer-songwriter Sarah Bareilles imagined the words of Barack Obama. She studied his speeches, she studied the many, many things that he said, and she imagined what he might have said in that 2016 presidential campaign. She allowed us to imagine his frustration and his broken heart. Who tells the story is incredibly important. And the fact that we now have the way to tell the story, the way to record the story, and who says what is news fits in our pocket each day. I remember clearly in 1991, Mike and I had gone on a vacation and we met a friend of a member of our family who worked in telecommunications, 1991. And he said to us, as we were all just beginning to log on to email, we hadn't had email very long, he said, it won't be long until your phone, your computer, your email, all of it is in one small package that you can fit in your pocket. It'll be on a mobile phone. Someone might as well have told me a month before that balloon lifted off the ground in Paris in the 1700s that would happen. I could not imagine it. It was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. Right? We are living in history. What is on the news now, the stories that we know now, are filmed by citizen journalists. The young woman who filmed the murder of George Floyd. We wouldn't have known that. We wouldn't have known without doubt what had happened had she not been there with her cell phone to record what had happened. And to be able to trust our news sources is something that can help us navigate this destabilizing time, to listen to other sources besides just what establishment wants us to hear. One way to break down the walls of history, is to listen to the voices of the as yet unheard, to engage in the process of decolonization. Maybe you've heard this word, decolonization. Writer Elisa Schoenberger writes about this in the work of many museums these days. This is contemporary work of lots of museums, which, as you know, are those keepers of history, the arbiters of what is worthy of representing a certain time, a certain school. She writes, the Washington Post defines decolonization as a process that institutions undergo to expand the perspectives that they portray beyond those of the dominant cultural group, particularly white colonizers. Museums are taking on this important work to try to make their institutions reflect the diversity and the voices of the people within their collections and around them. Many museums have legacies rooted in colonialism. Their collections were from wealthy donors who benefited from empires. For example, Sir Hans Sloane, who was a doctor and collector, funded his enormous collection that would be the foundation of the British Museum with earnings from his wife's slave plantations in Jamaica. Moreover, his collection profited from the reach of the British Empire, where collectors and travelers all over the world acquired items for him. Many collectors saw their efforts as a way to preserve the past, believing that the indigenous communities from whom they came would fade into obscurity. You've heard the saying that's attributed to Winston Churchill that history is written by the winners, the victors. Maybe that's true. What's important is that we seek out and listen to the voices of those that are not in the dominant narrative. This was one reason that slave narratives are so important today. As people, I grew up hearing that slavery was fairly benign. Sure, it was bad, but the people who were enslaved were mostly happy. And slave narratives, contemporary accounts, completely give lie to that fiction. Who tells the story is so important to the story that we receive. It's a part of white supremacy culture, the way that the stories are written and told to give a narrative that this is the way things are and the way they have been and the way they should be. The more that we ask the question, who says, why do they say, how do they benefit? The more we can begin to be unbound from the weight, the gravity that holds us down of white supremacy culture, the more we can ask the question, who says, why, who benefits from this narrative? When we can ask those questions and be in that dialogue, we can begin to expand and lift up and break that umbilical cord that ties us into old, damaging narratives. History is alive in each one of us, in the stories that we tell of our ancestors and the stories we tell to our descendants. We are a part of it. History lives in us, and we are living in an awe-filled and awful time. How we renew ourselves and each other is to continue talking, to avoid at all costs, avoid isolation. And that's a heavy lift right now, to avoid isolation, because we're stuck in our own homes. We can't be out in the way that we were. Many of us are still working and doing our jobs and going out and meeting people, but we're doing it behind a barrier. But to avoid isolation at all costs and continue talking about what meaning is for us. I know you folks have made a plan to vote in this historical election. My husband and I voted this week. Happy for good, clean elections in Minnesota. I know you've made a plan to vote. And my hope for all of us is that we continue tending to history and not letting it become calcified, but exploring it, helping it to lift off, unbound from the fetters of lies, untruths, and that we name what is so for us today.